Welcome to AM Best Audio.
At a time when the markets are closely watching every signal from the Federal Reserve, leadership at the central bank has never carried more weight. Few people understand the intersection of monetary policy, financial stability, and crisis management better than Kevin Warsh, whose experience stretches from the 2008 financial crisis to today's debates over inflation, quantitative easing, and the future direction of the Fed. Here to talk more about that is economist and director Ann Modica. And Ann, it's always great to see you.
Nice to see you too, John.
So Ann, can you tell us a little bit more about Kevin Warsh's background and why does his appointment matter?
Yeah, so I'll start off a little bit about his background. As you mentioned, he has been in the system for a while, and he is a former Federal Reserve governor who served on the board from about 2006 to 2011, right during the heart of the global financial crisis. And during this time, he was notably involved in the government response to the bailout of AIG and other financial institutions. He's also worked closely on broader financial stability issues that impact both banks and insurers. And more recently, he's worked in both academia and at an investment firm. His confirmation as Fed chair is obviously attracting attention because this would mark the first major leadership transition at the central bank after nearly a decade under Jerome Powell. I mean, Powell is widely seen by the markets, I think, as steady, predictable, familiar, and Warsh is slightly in a different category because he's a lesser known quantity. And I think the timing also matters during this transition. The Fed is still navigating a pretty complex macroeconomic backdrop, particularly with inflation, the conflict in the Middle East, and the debate surrounding the size of the balance sheet. So I think a Warsh appointment could signal a shift in how the central bank approaches these issues and how actively it sees its role in supporting the broader economy.
So, Ann, along those lines, has Warsh given us any clues as to how he would chair the Fed?
Yeah, I think one thing that he's been pretty clear on is he believes that quantitative easing should only be used during times of financial crisis or recession. I mean, the whole goal of quantitative easing is to lower interest rates, encourage borrowing and investing, and kind of keep money flowing through the economy. And to be fair, he did support the Fed's decision to undertake the first round of QE during the financial crisis. He thought that it was the Fed's job to provide liquidity during a time when financial markets were really not working, right? If you go back to that global financial crisis, you'll see that the bid-ask spreads were wide and people were not buying treasuries at auctions. So the whole system was gummed up and it needed support. So the Fed decided to push liquidity to keep the markets functioning and working. And he believed QE in that moment was about keeping the system functioning. However, the Fed did go on to implement several other rounds of QE that he did not agree with, and he resigned in early 2011 after the start of QE2.
So let's dig a little bit deeper into quantitative easing. Why was Warsh critical of the Fed's balance sheet and repeated rounds of QE?
So I think his criticism largely comes down to the idea that quantitative easing should only be an emergency tool, not a permanent feature of monetary policy. His argument was that once the market stabilized and the Fed kept going and they kept adding more rounds of asset purchases and expanding the balance sheet further, and quantitative easing isn't a free lunch. It does have consequences. And so he has several concerns that I can kind of filter out. And I think his first concern is that the QE distorts financial markets by keeping rates artificially low and pushing investors into more riskier assets. Second, I think it also inflates asset prices. I think the best example of this is when the Fed kept purchasing mortgage-backed securities well into 2021, when housing price appreciation was like in the double digits. I mean, he would argue that the mortgage market didn't need the support of QE at that time. Third, if you flood the system with excess liquidity, it could result in higher inflation that has consequences, particularly for those who can't afford it. Fourth, it raises the bar, I think, on what could be done during the next crisis. And finally, he's also argued that this level of intervention puts the Fed too much into the public spotlight, which makes it more politically exposed and vulnerable to attacks.
Customize your data experience. BestLink now offers an interactive company dashboard that provides company-level intelligence in a fast, user-friendly interface featuring interactive tables, charts, and Sparkline performance histories. Customize the dashboard tiles to prioritize the insurer ratings, data, and analytics that best support your workflow. AM Best. Our insight, your advantage.
Has he said anything about QE and fiscal policy?
So I think he's argued that the use of non-crisis QE has indirectly encouraged expansive fiscal policy and elevated government spending. So technically, let me be clear, the Fed doesn't finance government spending. But when it's buying large quantity of bonds in secondary markets, it does push down the borrowing cost and makes it easier, all things being equal, for the government to run larger deficits. And so Warsh contends that this dynamic is really beyond the Fed's scope of purpose and indirectly transfers some of the accountability, responsibility of fiscal policy to the Fed. He believes that blurring these lines increases the Fed's political visibility and makes the institution more vulnerable to political criticism and pressure.
The Federal Reserve has long operated pretty independently. Any concern about the Fed's future independence?
So this is, I guess, where things get a little more sensitive. I will say it's not unusual for presidents to criticize the Fed. This has happened across many administrations. I think what is different at times is how public and sustained that pressure becomes. I will say that the recent criticism of Powell has been unusually public and unusually frequent. And so while presidential frustration with the Fed is not unusual, these kind of sustained public attacks are less common because I think they can raise concerns about Fed independence. But I will say Warsh, for his part, has really emphasized the importance of Fed independence during his confirmation hearing. And I think so far, markets are taking him at his word. If you look at longer-term inflation expectations, they do remain well contained, signaling that the market is not really currently pricing in concerns about political interference in monetary policy. And, I think the most important point about this, and we shouldn't forget that, Warsh is just the chair of the FOMC. He's only one vote. There is a committee that makes these decisions.
What does it potentially look like with Warsh as the chair? Keyword here being potentially.
So, yeah, I think a Warsh-led Fed is likely to place more emphasis on keeping the central bank's balance sheet smaller, reducing it gradually, and using unconventional tools much more sparingly, if at all, and only during a time of crisis. I think, and this would mean that the Fed would be less willing to intervene during periods of volatility, market volatility, unless there's some kind of true systemic crisis in the system. He appears to believe that the Fed should return what he describes as the boring business of central banking, right? Focusing primarily on stable prices and employment. And I think for investors, though, this matters because markets have spent more than a decade operating in an environment where the Fed has been interventionalists, right? And I think a shift away from that philosophy could have meaningful implications for stocks, bonds, and overall market expectations.
Ann, it's always a pleasure to speak with you.
You too, John. Thank you.
That was AM Best economist and Director Ann Modica, and I'm John Weber for AM Best Audio.
Looking to get the full attention of the insurance industry? We have the platforms that will do just that. Whether it be AM Best TV, AM Best Audio, Best Review Magazine, or Best Day. Find out more by calling AM Best Advertising Sales at 908-439-2200, extension 5399, and have a great day.